August 1945. The world was burning. Japan stood alone, battered and bleeding, refusing to surrender even as American fire rained down from the skies. Cities were reduced to ash. Millions were dead. And yet the war continued, dragging both sides deeper into a nightmare that seemed to have no end. In the final days of World War II, most people were simply trying to survive. They woke each morning not knowing if they would see the evening. They kissed their children goodbye, unsure if they would ever hold them again. Fear had become the only constant in a world that had forgotten what peace looked like. Among those millions trying to survive was a young Japanese engineer named Tsutomu Yamaguchi. He was 29 years old, married, with a baby son waiting for him at home. He worked for Mitsubishi Heavy Industries, designing oil tankers in a country that desperately needed ships to replace the ones being destroyed faster than they could be built. In early August of 1945, Yamaguchi was sent on a business trip to Hiroshima. It was supposed to be a routine assignment. 3 months of work, designing tankers at the Mitsubishi shipyard. Nothing unusual, nothing dangerous, just another job in a nation at war. He had no idea he was walking into the center of history itself. Hiroshima in the summer of 1945 was a city holding its breath. With a population of around 350,000 people, it had somehow been spared the worst of the American firebombing campaign that had destroyed Tokyo, Osaka, and so many other cities. People whispered about why they had been overlooked. Some thought Hiroshima's military importance made it too valuable to destroy. Others believed the Americans were saving it for something else, though they couldn't imagine what. The city went about its business with a strange, nervous energy. Children played in the streets. People lined up for rations. Workers trudged to factories. Everyone knew the war was going badly, but they pushed those thoughts aside and focused on the day in front of them. What else could they do? Yamaguchi spent his days at the shipyard, hunched over technical drawings, calculating stress loads and hull designs. The work was exhausting, but it kept his mind occupied. At night he lay in his small room and thought about his wife, Hisako, and their infant son. He counted the days until his assignment would end and he could go home to Nagasaki. August 6th, his last day in Hiroshima. The morning began like any other. Yamaguchi woke early, dressed and prepared for one final day of work before catching the train home. The sky was clear and blue, the kind of perfect summer morning that makes you forget, just for a moment, that the world is at war. He left his lodging and began walking toward the shipyard. The streets were already busy with people heading to work, to market, to school. An ordinary Monday morning in a city that had been lucky so far. At exactly 8:15, Tsutomu Yamaguchi's life changed forever. He heard it first, a distant sound high above. The drone of aircraft engines. People paused and looked up, shielding their eyes from the sun. Air raid sirens had not sounded, just a few planes flying very high, nothing to worry about. Then the sky exploded. There are moments in history when time itself seems to fracture. When the world splits into before and after, and nothing will ever be the same again. This was one of those moments. A flash of light brighter than 1,000 suns tore across Hiroshima. In that instant, Yamaguchi was thrown to the ground as if an invisible hand had swatted him from the sky. The air itself seemed to catch fire. His skin burned, his ears filled with a roar so loud it seemed to come from inside his own skull. He couldn't see, he couldn't hear, he couldn't think. The world had ended. What Tsutomu Yamaguchi had just witnessed was something no human being had ever experienced before. At 8:15 and 45 seconds that morning, an American B-29 bomber named Enola Gay had released a single bomb over the center of Hiroshima. A bomb unlike any other in history. Little Boy, they called it. The world's first atomic weapon used in warfare. In 1/10 of a millionth of a second, the uranium core reached critical mass. The temperature at the center of the explosion reached several million degrees. A ball of fire expanded across the city at the speed of light itself. Buildings evaporated, steel melted. Human beings were turned to shadow and ash before they even knew what was happening. 70,000 people died in an instant. Yamaguchi lay on the ground, his body screaming in pain. His left side was badly burned. His face, his arm, his legs. The skin hung in strips. He couldn't understand what had happened. His mind kept trying to make sense of it, but there was no sense to be made. Slowly, he became aware of sounds, screaming, moaning, the crackle of fire. He forced himself to stand, though every movement was agony. When he opened his eyes, he saw hell on earth. The city was gone. Where buildings had stood moments before, there was nothing but flattened rubble and flames. The sky had turned black with smoke and dust. People wandered through the streets like ghosts, their clothes burned away, their skin hanging from their bodies in sheets. Many were silent, too shocked even to cry out. Others screamed for help that would never come. Yamaguchi stumbled forward, not knowing where he was going, driven by pure survival instinct. He had to get away, had to find safety. But there was no safety anywhere. The entire city was burning. He found his two colleagues from Mitsubishi, both of them injured but alive. Together they began to move through the ruins, stepping over bodies, dodging falling debris, breathing air thick with ash and the smell of burning flesh. What are the odds of surviving something like that? Of being close enough to ground zero to be severely burned, yet far enough away to still be alive? Yamaguchi would spend the rest of his life trying to answer that question. They walked for hours through the devastation. Every street looked the same. Destruction without end. The fires were so intense that the smoke blocked out the sun, turning day into a twilight of horror. People begged for water. Children cried for their mothers. The dead were everywhere, piled in the streets, floating in the rivers. Finally, Yamaguchi and his colleagues reached the train station, or what was left of it. Incredibly, despite the total destruction around them, the railway lines were still intact. Trains were still running, evacuating survivors out of the city. With his skin burned and his body in shock, Yamaguchi climbed aboard a train heading west. Away from Hiroshima, away from the nightmare, he was going home to Nagasaki. The train ride took all night. Yamaguchi drifted in and out of consciousness, his burns throbbing, his mind unable to process what he had witnessed. Other survivors packed into the train car with him, all of them bearing the same haunted look in their eyes, the look of people who had seen the end of the world. When dawn broke on August 7th, the train pulled into Nagasaki station. Yamaguchi stumbled off, barely able to walk. His wife, Hisako, was waiting for him. When she saw his condition, she cried out in horror. His face was burned beyond recognition. His left arm was wrapped in makeshift bandages. He could barely speak. She brought him home and did what she could to tend his wounds. There were no hospitals, no doctors available. Everyone was overwhelmed. She cleaned his burns as gently as possible while he told her, in broken fragments, what had happened in Hiroshima. A single bomb, he said, one bomb that destroyed an entire city. She could hardly believe it. How was such a thing possible? But Yamaguchi had seen it with his own eyes. He had felt the heat that could melt steel. He had walked through streets where tens of thousands had died in seconds. He knew what the Americans had created, a weapon of unimaginable power, and he prayed that Nagasaki would be spared. For 2 days, Yamaguchi lay in bed, his body fighting to heal from injuries that should have killed him. The burns covered much of his left side. He had been exposed to massive amounts of radiation, though he didn't understand that yet. No one did. The doctors in Japan had no idea what radiation sickness was. They couldn't treat what they couldn't identify. On the morning of August 9th, just 3 days after Hiroshima, Yamaguchi felt strong enough to return to work. His supervisors at Mitsubishi needed a report on what had happened. The company had lost its entire Hiroshima facility. They needed to understand what kind of weapon could do such damage. So Yamaguchi, still wrapped in bandages, still in tremendous pain, dragged himself to the Mitsubishi office in Nagasaki. He sat down with his supervisor and began to describe what he had witnessed. One bomb, he said, a single bomb destroyed the entire city. The flash was like the sun itself. The heat was unbearable. Everything just disappeared. His supervisor struggled to comprehend it. How could one bomb do what Yamaguchi was describing? It seemed impossible, insane. They were still discussing it when at exactly 11:02 in the morning, a familiar sound cut through their conversation. Aircraft engines, high overhead. No, it couldn't be. Not again. Not here. For the second time in 3 days, Tsutomu Yamaguchi found himself beneath an atomic bomb. The flash came first, that same terrible light that burned itself into your eyes even when they were closed. Then the shockwave, slamming through the building like the fist of an angry god. Windows shattered, walls cracked, the entire structure shook as if the earth itself was trying to tear it apart. Yamaguchi threw himself to the floor, his mind screaming in disbelief. This couldn't be happening. It was impossible. What kind of cruel fate would bring a man through one atomic bombing only to trap him in another? The bomb that fell on Nagasaki was called Fat Man. It was more powerful than Little Boy, releasing an explosive force equivalent to 21,000 tons of TNT. The temperature at the center of the blast reached 7,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Everything within a half-mile radius simply ceased to exist. 40,000 people died instantly. Another 40,000 would die in the weeks and months that followed. But Tsutomu Yamaguchi somehow survived again. When the shaking stopped and the roar faded, Yamaguchi lifted his head. He was alive, injured again, burned again, but alive. His supervisor lay nearby, also breathing. The building had partially collapsed, but they were in a section that remained standing. 2 atomic bombs. 3 days apart, and he had survived them both. What are the odds? Not just of surviving one atomic explosion, but 2. Of being in 2 different cities at the exact moment history chose to destroy them. The mathematical probability is almost incalculable. Millions to 1. Billions to 1. Was it luck? Or was it something else? Some terrible purpose that fate had in store for him? Yamaguchi didn't have time to wonder. He had to get home, had to find his wife and son, had to know if they had survived. He climbed through the rubble and out into the streets. Once again, he found himself in a city transformed into hell. The familiar streets of Nagasaki, where he had lived and worked, where his family made their home, were gone, replaced by fire and destruction and death. He ran through the chaos, his burned body protesting every step. His house was in the Urakami district, one of the areas closest to the explosion. If it had been destroyed, if his family had been inside, he found his house damaged but still standing. The blast had torn off the roof and collapsed one wall, but the structure held. And, inside, huddled in what remained of their home, were Hisako and their baby son. They were alive. All 3 of them had survived. In that moment, as Yamaguchi held his wife and child among the ruins of their home, with the city burning around them and the screams of the dying filling the air, something broke inside him. Or perhaps something was forged. A determination, a purpose. He had survived hell twice. That meant something. It had to mean something. The weeks that followed were a blur of suffering. Yamaguchi's burns became infected. His hair fell out. He developed fevers and stomach pain. The radiation was destroying his body from the inside, though he still didn't know what radiation was. Hisako cared for him as best she could, but she was sick too. They had all been exposed. Their baby son developed strange symptoms. For months, they weren't sure any of them would survive. But they did. Slowly, painfully, their bodies healed. The burns scarred over, the fevers passed. Against all odds, the Yamaguchi family endured. Japan surrendered on August 15th, 6 days after the Nagasaki bombing. The war was finally over. The dying could stop. But for Tsutomu Yamaguchi, the war would never truly end. He carried it with him every day for the rest of his life, in the scars on his skin, in the memories that invaded his sleep, in the faces of the dead that he could never forget. For decades, he rarely spoke about what he had experienced. In post-war Japan, hibakusha, atomic bomb survivors, faced stigma and discrimination. People feared they were contaminated, diseased. Some survivors hid their past, pretending they had been somewhere else when the bombs fell. Yamaguchi went back to work at Mitsubishi. He raised his family. He tried to live a normal life. But nothing was normal. How could it be? He had seen things no human should ever see. He had felt the heat of the sun turned into a weapon. He had walked through cities where the very shadows of people were burned into walls, the only trace that they had ever existed. He carried the weight of 2 atomic bombs on his shoulders. It wasn't until 2009, when Yamaguchi was 90 years old, that the Japanese government officially recognized him as a double hibakusha, a survivor of both atomic bombings. He was the only person ever officially recognized as such, though it's possible others survived both bombs but never came forward. Why did he finally speak out? Why, after so many decades of silence, did he choose to tell his story? Because he realized that he had a responsibility. He was a witness to the worst weapon humanity had ever created. He had felt its power twice. If he didn't speak, if he didn't testify to what nuclear weapons actually do, then who would? In his final years, Yamaguchi became an advocate for nuclear disarmament. He spoke at schools, at conferences, to anyone who would listen. He described the flash, the heat, the destruction. He told them about the people who evaporated, leaving only shadows, about the children who died slowly from radiation sickness, about the survivors who spent the rest of their lives carrying invisible wounds. The only people who should be allowed to govern countries with nuclear weapons are those who have been burned by them, he said. The rest of us don't understand what we're playing with. He had seen the future if humanity failed to learn from history. A future where cities could be erased in seconds, where weapons of ultimate destruction existed, waiting to be used again, where the mistakes of 1945 could be repeated on an even more terrible scale. Was he bitter? Angry at the Americans who had dropped the bombs? Angry at the Japanese leaders who had refused to surrender, prolonging the war? Not really. He had moved past anger. He had seen too much death to waste energy on hate. Instead, he focused on a simple message. This must never happen again. In January 2010, at the age of 93, Tsutomu Yamaguchi died of stomach cancer. The cancer was likely caused by the radiation exposure he had suffered 65 years earlier. The bombs that had failed to kill him twice had finally claimed him decades later. But he had outlived most of the other survivors. He had raised his family, he had told his story, and he had passed on a warning to future generations. Think about the impossibility of his survival. To be in Hiroshima on August 6th and Nagasaki on August 9th. To be close enough to both explosions to suffer severe burns, yet far enough away to live. To endure radiation poisoning that killed thousands of others. To survive when the odds were astronomically against him. Some called it a miracle. Others called it the cruelest joke fate had ever played. To survive once is lucky. To survive twice feels like something else, like the universe had chosen him for a reason. Maybe it did. Maybe Tsutomu Yamaguchi was meant to live so that he could testify, so that he could look the world in the eye and say, I was there, I felt it, I saw what these weapons do, and you must never, ever use them again. His story forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about the weapons we've created, about the capacity for destruction we've unleashed, about the fact that somewhere in the world, right now, there are thousands of nuclear weapons waiting in silos and submarines, each one far more powerful than the bombs that destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki. What would Yamaguchi think if he could see the world today? Would he be relieved that nuclear weapons haven't been used in combat since 1945? Or would he be terrified by how many now exist, how much more powerful they've become, and how close we've come to using them again? We like to think we've learned from the past, that we're too smart, too civilized, too evolved to repeat the mistakes of history. But are we? Tsutomu Yamaguchi survived the unsurvivable, not once, but twice. He lived to tell his story, to carry his warning, to remind us of what happens when humanity's worst impulses combine with its most powerful weapons. His scars healed, but the scars on the world remain. Hiroshima and Nagasaki stand as monuments to human ingenuity and human horror. They remind us what we're capable of creating and what we're capable of destroying. And in a small way, Yamaguchi's story reminds us that even in the darkest moments, even when the world is ending around you, survival is possible. Not just physical survival, but the survival of hope, of purpose, of the belief that tomorrow might be better than today. He could have given up. He could have let the trauma destroy him. Instead, he chose to live, to bear witness, to speak for those who couldn't. That's the real story of the man who survived Hiroshima twice. Not just a story of impossible luck or statistical anomaly, but a story of a man who faced the worst humanity could offer and chose to respond not with bitterness, but with a message of warning and hope. We owe it to him and to all the victims of those terrible August days to listen. If you want to uncover more forgotten stories buried by time, subscribe to Battle Echoes, where the past still speaks.